Good morning. Welcome back to another episode of Time Out for Black History. This would be episode 9 in the chronological look at kind of the Black experience in America. Today I want to talk about the founding documents, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and their relationship to slavery and race. Because it's been a debate recently about whether our founding documents are, layered with racism and undertones of inequality, even in the document. And so I was reading up and I came across an article written by Dr. David Azarad from the Heritage Foundation. And he was making an argument that the Constitution is not a racist document, that the founding fathers didn't have the concept of race that we have today. Essentially, he says such arguments have unsettling implications, causes us to be ashamed of our founding documents and of our origins. I find that to be a very interesting position to take, to say we shouldn't talk bad about the founding documents because it makes us feel bad about being Americans. So I wanted to get much more and kind of dissect the actual documents, the men who wrote the documents, in order to have a better understanding of the true answer to this question. Far too often, I think that because somebody has doctor in front of their name, we tend to give their arguments complete trust. And I think that while getting a doctorate is a very important thing, it doesn't make your opinions absolute. And so we can look at these and kind of see if we agree with him or don't agree with him. So if we first look at the Declaration of Independence, and we know the crafter of the Declaration of Independence was Thomas Jefferson. And I think, again, one of probably the most misrepresented human beings in history, maybe. Here's a man who is seen as, really the creator of independence. Again, not one of the drafters of the Constitution, main drafters of the Constitution, but penned the words using Thomas Paine and some other people for our right to self-govern, our right to break away from England. Now, here's a man who was torn and conflicted on every level. Now, I'm not talking about torn and conflicted on what he thought was right or wrong, but what he should do. So, Thomas Jefferson owned around 600 slaves in his lifetime. He himself was never associated with violence against his slaves, but his overseers on his plantation were known to be exceptionally cruel to the slaves that worked on Thomas Jefferson's plantation. Thomas Jefferson referred to slavery as a moral depravity. He called it a hideous blot in our history. And so to know that he knew that slavery was a horrid institution is not to be debated. Those people would say they didn't know any better. He knew better. He knew exactly what he was doing. Even to, and you can research this up yourself, his relationship to Sally Hemings, who was one of his slaves. He began assaulting her when she was about 13 years old, and fathered several children with her. Now, history wants to paint this as like a beautiful mixed race family, but that's not what slavery was. That's not what that relationship was. And so it's important to understand kind of how these men viewed society at the time that they wrote these documents. And in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson aimed to abolish the transatlantic slave trade because he again saw the moral depravity in it. But the southern states would not agree to it, and so therefore they couldn't do it. So it stayed a part of America until roughly 1808, the transatlantic slave trade. And even then, past that illegally. So, if we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence, we can make an argument that Thomas Jefferson knew the transatlantic slave trade was wrong. Many Americans knew it was wrong, but they were unwilling to do what was necessary. And the thing I must clarify, you cannot differentiate slavery from race in 1776 America. To be a slave meant you were black. In most parts of the country, to be black meant to be a slave. So you can't pretend that race and slavery weren't like this. And so once we establish that, then I think the question becomes different. You can argue semantics all you want. You can argue, well, they didn't say this, but policies, words, all added up to that, you know? So then we move over to the Constitution. And 25 of the 55 drafters that signed the Declaration, that signed the Constitution, 25 of the 55 were slave owners, which is a pretty big number considering only 25% of Southerners actually own slaves. So to have 25 of 55 of the drafters be slave owners when such a small percentage of Americans actually own slaves, that's actually a pretty big number. But those were the power players because they had the assets of slaves and had the wealth that came with slaves. And those 25, they owned about 1,700 slaves between them. Okay, so these are men that did not have a vested interest in ending the slave system. So when we look at the Constitution and we look at the ways that slavery was acknowledged in the Constitution, the first way it's obviously acknowledged is it's not abolished. Despite it being something that every one of those men was well aware was not consistent with the words of either the Declaration of Independence or the words of the Constitution. They also put in there a stipulation that they would not discuss slavery again until 1808. So 20 years later would be the first time that slavery would again be debated, thus leaving it to their children to decide the fate of slavery. You know, if we want to argue this or that, it looked like slavery was dying by the 1790s. It was becoming too difficult to de-seed cotton. It wasn't becoming as lucrative. And so there was this belief that slavery would eventually die out on its own. But Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin in 1793, which changes the whole game. And slavery begins to flourish again, and better than it's ever flourished. And so, again, the fact that they say that they're going to look at it in 1808 tells me that they knew this was an issue. They knew this was a problem. But in the founding documents, they chose to ignore that problem. And the last time it's referenced in the Constitution is under the 3/5 Compromise. Now, this is worse than it sounds. So these are white men debating the value of a black human being. And not the value of that black human being toward that black human being, but the value of that black human being toward the power a white man would have, if you understand what I'm saying. Blacks were worth 0/5 of a human being when it came to them. But when it came to Southern representation and how many congressmen they got, blacks were worth 3/5 of a human being. So again, if you need a number to show how they viewed race, and again, don't tell me slavery had nothing to do with race. This was a race-based system, chattel slavery based on race. So it's important that we understand that the founding documents were indeed infused with racism. They were indeed infused with the ability to rationalize slavery. Now, in time, we can argue that as slavery disappeared, that relationship disappeared. But the founding documents, when written, were founding documents that had hints of racism in them. So again, please subscribe to the channel. Please share this with somebody. Again, I think this is good information. It's stuff that will help you understand kind of how other people maybe see the world a little bit differently than you and why the world looks the way it does. All right? I'll see you next time.